Welcome, my dear literature enthusiasts, to a space where films are not simply consumed as spectacle, but explored as though they were living texts, rich with metaphor, rhythm, and meaning. I'm so glad you've chosen to be here, because what we're about to embark on together is not a straightforward review, nor a casual recap. This is not about recommending or rejecting, nor about tallying box office numbers. This is instead an intellectual conversation, one designed for readers of stories, lovers of allegory, seekers of truth disguised as fiction. Before we wander into this journey, let me gently ask you to like this video, to subscribe, to remain with us as part of this growing circle of reflective minds. Together we've built a community that doesn't just watch films, but interrogates them, unearths the poetry hiding under explosions, the fragility under spectacle. And let me be clear from the beginning. What follows is not a real review in the traditional sense. This is a critical, theoretical, and deeply literary analysis, crafted for those of us who love to pull apart narrative threads until they reveal something larger than the sum of their images. The film we turn to now is Olympus Has Fallen, 2013. I remember the first time I encountered this story. It was late at night, one of those evenings when the world outside feels brittle with silence, and I pressed play with the kind of casual expectation one reserves for an action thriller. But very quickly, I felt something shift. Yes, there were explosions and battles. Yes, there were moments of intense choreography and spectacle, but beneath the surface, I sensed another narrative at work. One about loyalty and betrayal, about fragility disguised as power, about the haunting vulnerability of symbols we so often take for granted. That recognition pulled me in not because it promised escape, but because it reflected something I'd been wrestling with in my own life. The realization that what we imagine to be stable, eternal, or unbreakable is often more fragile than we dare to admit. The story situates us within the beating heart of power, inside a building that is not merely an architectural structure, but a living emblem of stability, continuity, and permanence. That such a place could fall, that it could be scarred and broken, is in itself a shocking proposition. Watching that unfold, I felt the dual pull of horror and fascination. Horror, because the destruction of such a symbol carries with it echoes of collective trauma, the kind of images that lodge in our cultural memory and refuse to be dislodged. Fascination, because in literature as in life, it is always when permanence collapses that the truth of humanity shines through. Monuments tell us who we think we are. Their destruction tells us who we really are. The film's opening moments lull us with ceremony, with routines of governance and protection. There's a sense of order, of choreography, of roles clearly defined, the leader shielded by guards, the machinery of protection moving with elegance and precision. But like all tragedies, the calm is not meant to last. The first tremors arrive as whispers, small disruptions that hint at a storm gathering beneath the surface. When the attack finally comes, it is brutal in its suddenness, methodical in its execution. The institution we imagined untouchable is breached with terrifying ease. Explosions rend the air, corridors become battlefields, and symbols that once stood for stability are swallowed by fire and smoke. It is not only a siege of a building, but of an idea, the idea that power, housed in architecture, can ever truly be invulnerable. At the center of this storm is the protector, a man whose life has been shaped by duty and sacrifice. He is not drawn as a flawless hero, but as someone carrying wounds, both visible and invisible. His loyalty is fierce, sometimes almost obsessive, as though the act of protection has become not merely a job, but a calling, a form of penance, a way to define his own worth. I felt myself drawn to him, not because of his strength, but because of his fractures. Watching him navigate chaos, dragging others toward survival, improvising against impossible odds, I was reminded of those moments in life when we too are thrust into crises that strip away illusion, leaving only instinct and resilience. He fights, yes, but more importantly, he endures, and endurance in this story is everything. The plot unfolds like a descent into an underworld. The safe spaces we imagined are revealed as traps. The corridors of power become labyrinths of vulnerability. Allies are scattered. Enemies lurk in uniforms once trusted, and every step deeper into the building feels like a step further into a nightmare. It is precisely in these corridors of darkness that humanity is revealed. Leaders stripped of authority are reduced to fragile men clinging to survival. The protector, bruised and battered, discovers reserves of loyalty that tether him to his duty even when logic suggests surrender. And the orchestrators of this chaos, cold and calculating, embody not madness but conviction. Men who believe so deeply in their cause that destruction becomes their scripture. What makes this story resonate beyond its spectacle are the twists threaded through its structure. Just when you imagine safety might return, another betrayal is revealed, another trap springs shut, another illusion shatters. It reminded me of Gothic novels where the house itself conspires against its inhabitants, where every door conceals menace, where the familiar becomes uncanny. Here, too, the building is no longer a sanctuary but a haunted labyrinth, echoing with the footsteps of both saviors and destroyers. That inversion, the safe turned deadly, the permanent turned fragile, is the beating heart of the narrative's symbolism. I remember leaning forward during my first viewing, not merely because the explosions gripped me, but because I wanted to see how far the story would go in dismantling its own illusions. The deeper the descent, the clearer it became that this was not only about a siege, but about exposure. The exposure of fragility within strength, of betrayal within loyalty, of mortality within power. For me, that exposure resonated deeply because it mirrored truths I had begun to discover in my own life. That control is always fleeting, that protection can never be absolute, and that sometimes survival itself is the only form of victory. The film teases us with the promise of triumph, but it is never a clean triumph. Each major twist, whether the revelation of hidden enemies, the collapse of escape routes, or the discovery of just how deeply the conspiracy runs, strips away another layer of certainty. Even the moments of apparent rescue are haunted by the knowledge that safety is temporary, that the siege has already left scars no resolution can fully erase. This refusal to offer comfort is, to me, one of the story's greatest strengths. Literature teaches us that catharsis is not always found in happy endings, but in recognition of fragility, of resilience, of the paradox of survival. And here, too, the film's greatest offering is recognition. That endurance is itself a kind of heroism, that to emerge scarred but breathing is sometimes the only triumph available. As the story hurtles toward its climax, the tension tightens until every movement feels suffused with inevitability. The protector, carrying wounds both personal and national, presses deeper into the heart of danger. The protector, carrying wounds both personal and national, presses deeper into the heart of danger, not because he believes victory is guaranteed, but because to abandon his duty would be to abandon himself. The leader, once a distant symbol of authority, becomes simply a man, his survival dependent on trust and faith in another. The orchestrators, convinced of their righteousness, push their conviction to the edge of madness, burning not only structures, but the very illusion of safety. And through it all, the city beyond waits, scarred by smoke, its skyline a reminder that permanence is never what it seems. What lingers for me, after all this, is not the spectacle, but the allegory. The fall of a monument is the fall of illusion. The survival of the protector is the persistence of loyalty in a world that constantly betrays. The vulnerability of leaders is the truth that authority is only ever human. The conviction of enemies is the danger of belief without empathy. These are not merely plot points. They are themes woven into the marrow of the story, resonating long after the last explosion fades. So here, my friends, is where our introduction draws to a close. We have glimpsed the story's surface, the siege, the protector, the betrayals, the collapse. We have teased at its deeper elements, the fragility of permanence, the resilience of loyalty, the haunting nature of betrayal, the inversion of sanctuary into labyrinth. And now we stand at the threshold of deeper analysis, ready to peel back layer after layer, to trace the allegories, the themes, the symbols that breathe beneath the fire and smoke. If you stayed with me this far, then I know you too are searching for something more in cinema, for meaning, for resonance, for truths disguised in fiction. And so I invite you, warmly and sincerely, to stay with this channel, to subscribe, to continue walking with me through films not as entertainment alone, but as literature in motion. Together, we will keep exploring, keep uncovering, keep reflecting. Because in the end, these stories are not only about what collapses on screen, but about what they awaken in us. The recognition of fragility, the persistence of resilience, the haunting beauty of survival. The air at the beginning is deceptively calm, filled with the ordinary rhythms of duty and ceremony. The kind of atmosphere that suggests security is not only present, but absolute. There is snow on the ground, a chill in the air, and at the heart of this opening movement is a motorcade cutting through the wintry landscape. It feels almost ceremonial, a ritual of power wrapped in the everyday efficiency of train protection. Cars glide in formation, every move deliberate, every glance calculated, as if the machinery of safety itself has been rehearsed to perfection. At the center of this carefully orchestrated choreography is the protector, a man whose entire life has been shaped by his devotion to the one figure riding ahead. The leader of a nation, a man who embodies not only authority, but symbolism, permanence, and continuity. There's an intimacy in these opening scenes, a suggestion that beyond the political roles and titles there exists a bond built on trust. The protector is not simply an employee or a faceless agent of security. He has earned a closeness, a familiarity that extends into the personal. The leader's family, the First Lady, in particular, shares moments with him that are warm, almost familial. They tease, they laugh, they acknowledge his presence not with distance, but with affection. He is not only there to shield them. He is part of their world, welcomed into the delicate intimacy of their lives. It is this closeness, this bond, that makes the moments which follow so devastating. For tragedy, as literature teaches us, always arrives in silence before it bursts into sound. The winter night grows darker. The motorcade moves through the storm, and then chaos tears through the quiet. An accident, sudden and brutal, erupts on the icy roads. The vehicles spin, metal collides with metal, screams slice through the storm. The protector reacts instantly, instincts honed through years of training, pulling the leader to safety, dragging him away from the wreckage. But there are some rescues even the most vigilant cannot make. The First Lady's car dangles precariously over the bridge, suspended between survival and the abyss below. The protector battles the storm, battles time, battles inevitability itself as he tries to reach her. Yet despite his strength, despite his devotion, fate intervenes. The car plunges into the darkness, swallowed by icy water, and the woman whose laughter filled the earlier moments is lost. The grief that follows is twofold. It is personal and it is symbolic. The leader mourns his wife, his world shattered by the sudden, unyielding cruelty of chance. But the protector carries his own wound, heavier than any physical scar. The knowledge that despite everything, despite his vigilance and his devotion, he could not save her. This loss becomes the fracture line in his life, splitting it into before and after. His failure haunts him not only because of what it cost the leader, but because it shakes the very foundation of his identity. A protector who fails is no longer whole. And so he withdraws, not from loyalty, but from shame, from the gnawing belief that he can no longer be trusted with the responsibility that once defined him. Time passes, and with it the illusion of healing. The leader, still carrying the weight of grief, continues his role, flanked by new layers of security, surrounded by protocols and routines meant to restore stability. The protector is no longer by his side. He has been reassigned, moved into quieter duties, his bond with the leader left fractured, his sense of purpose adrift. Life continues, but under the surface, scars remain unhealed. This quiet fracture is important because it plants the seed for the crisis that follows. The knowledge that duty, loyalty, and identity are all fragile, all vulnerable to collapse. The city, meanwhile, carries on in its rhythms, unaware of the storm that is about to arrive. A foreign delegation prepares to meet the leader, an event draped in ceremony and diplomacy. The air is filled with the weight of protocol, with motorcades and salutes and speeches rehearsed to perfection. Everything suggests stability, order, continuity. Yet literature warns us that stability is always the mass chaos whereas before it strikes. And in this case, chaos arrives not as whispers, but as a brutal, orchestrated assault. The attack is sudden, calculated, and merciless. A plane appears over the city, its presence unexpected, its trajectory wrong. It descends with deadly precision, unleashing fire upon the very heart of power. Explosions tear through the sky, weapons scream, and in a matter of moments the illusion of control shatters. Streets fill with panic, soldiers fall, and symbols of security crumble into ash. The city's monuments, once standing for permanence, are scarred in fire, their smoke rising like dark omens into the sky. The leader is swept into the corridors of safety, surrounded by agents whose duty is to shield him at all costs. But as the attack unfolds, the terrifying truth becomes clear. The enemy is not outside the gates. It is within. The carefully orchestrated assault reveals a depth of planning that is chilling. The attackers know the routines, the defenses, the blind spots. The very protocols designed to protect are turned into weaknesses, exploited with ruthless efficiency. Allies reveal themselves as traitors. Uniforms that once promised safety conceal enemies armed with betrayal. It is not simply a siege. It is an invasion from within, a collapse of trust as devastating as the physical destruction itself. The protector, though no longer part of the inner circle, is nearby when the chaos erupts. Instinct drives him, the old devotion still smoldering despite the fractures of the past. While others flee or falter, he moves into the fire, muscle memory and loyalty guiding his every step. He fights not with the detachment of duty, but with the urgency of personal redemption. Every blow, every desperate maneuver fueled by the need to protect the man whose trust he once lost. Watching him carve his way through smoke and gunfire, I couldn't help but feel the resonance of literature's tragic heroes, men who stumble under the weight of failure, only to rise again when the world demands their devotion once more. The corridors of power transform into a labyrinth of shadows and blood. Walls echo with gunfire. Once sacred chambers become battlefields. The leader, stripped of ceremony, becomes a hunted man, his survival hinging not on his authority, but on the loyalty of the one figure fighting his way toward him. The protector's journey through these corridors is harrowing. Ambushes at every turn, allies cut down, enemies flooding like shadows through the halls. Yet each step forward carries him closer not only to the leader, but to his own redemption. Every scar he takes, every risk he shoulders, is a quiet confession that he is still who he was, that loyalty still defines him, that failure does not erase devotion. Outside, the city reels in chaos. Sirens scream, streets burn, and civilians scatter in terror. The skyline, once a symbol of stability, becomes an image of fragility, fire curling into the air like a warning that permanence is always an illusion. The attack is not only on the building, but on the idea it represents. And as smoke darkens the horizon, the entire nation feels the weight of its vulnerability. Within the besieged corridors, the orchestrators of chaos reveal themselves. They are not faceless shadows, but figures of conviction, men who believe their cause justifies the destruction they unleash. They do not fight with randomness, but with a terrifying sense of purpose. Every move calculated, every strike meant not just to kill, but to humiliate. Their presence is chilling not because they are monsters, but because they are human beings consumed by conviction, their certainty burning brighter than empathy. And it is this conviction that makes them dangerous, their eyes lit with the fire of those who believe destruction is the only path to justice. The leader, captured and dragged into the heart of the siege, becomes a prisoner within his own house. Stripped of authority, stripped of command, he is reduced to a man at the mercy of those who despise him. This inversion is symbolic. The figure who once embodied strength and continuity is revealed as fragile, vulnerable, mortal. His survival depends not on power, but on faith. Faith that someone, somewhere, still fights for him. And that someone, battered and bloodied, is the protector pressing deeper into the labyrinth, refusing to yield despite every wound, every obstacle, every reminder of past failure. The first half of the story spirals toward this grim tableau, a city in chaos, a monument to permanence scarred and broken, a leader imprisoned by those who despise him, and a protector clawing his way through the smoke not only to rescue another man, but to salvage his own fractured identity. It is a descent into darkness, into betrayal, into the shattering of illusions. And yet, within that darkness flickers the fragile, stubborn light of loyalty, of devotion, of resilience. Because even as explosions echo and betrayals multiply, the protector presses forward, not because he believes he will succeed, but because to stop would be to surrender the last of who he is. And in that persistence, the story's heartbeat emerges. That survival, that loyalty, that fragile refusal to yield is itself a kind of triumph, even in the face of overwhelming collapse. Smoke still hangs heavy over the city as the story pushes deeper into its labyrinth. The siege is no longer a sudden eruption, but a suffocating permanence, pressing down on everyone trapped inside the scarred halls of power. The once untouchable symbol of authority has been breached, the leader torn from safety and held like a prize in the hands of those who despise him. What began as chaos has crystallized into occupation, a carefully calculated stranglehold designed not just to humiliate, but to destabilize, to remind the world that even its mightiest symbols can collapse in hours. The protector moves through this nightmare, not as a spectator, but as a ghost threading his way past enemies, slipping into shadows, carving a path closer to the heart of the siege. His body carries the marks of every battle already fought, bruises blooming beneath his armor, breath ragged from the relentlessness of his pursuit. Yet his focus is unshaken. If in the early moments his actions felt like instinct, now they feel like destiny. Every step forward is charged with urgency. Not only the urgency of saving the leader, but the urgency of proving to himself that he is not defined by the failure that haunts him. The corridors of the building have transformed into a maze of traps and ambushes. Enemies lie in wait with the patience of predators. Familiar rooms have been twisted into fortresses, and every corner carries the promise of another firefight. What gives these sequences their power is not only the choreography of action, but the weight of betrayal woven into them. The protector knows now that the enemy's strength is not just in numbers or weaponry, but in foreknowledge. They know the codes, the defenses, the weak spots. Somewhere, deep within the machinery of trust, betrayal has festered. This recognition gives each encounter a symbolic weight. Every enemy taken down is not just a body in the way, but a shadow of treachery confronted and overcome. Meanwhile, in a chamber once reserved for command and order, the leader faces the orchestrators directly. They do not hide in shadows. They speak with conviction, their words as sharp as their weapons. What unsettles most is not their violence, but their certainty. They believe themselves righteous, their cause burning brighter than empathy, their vengeance justified by history and grievance. They do not want only to kill. They want to humiliate, to turn the symbol of power into a symbol of helplessness. The leader, bound and stripped of authority, becomes simply a man, a fragile life dangled as leverage. This inversion is devastating. The one who once embodied continuity is reduced to silence. Survival dependent not on the machinery of state, but on the loyalty of a single man clawing his way toward him. The Protector's journey deepens into a series of brutal confrontations, each one pushing him further into the heart of the siege. He improvises weapons from the environment, turns shadows into allies, moves with a relentlessness that feels almost mythic. And yet, what makes these moments powerful is not invincibility, but vulnerability. He is wounded, battered, nearly broken, and the audience feels every ounce of his exhaustion. This is not the clean efficiency of a flawless hero. This is survival scraped from blood and determination. His resilience resonates because it mirrors our own fragile persistence in crises, the refusal to yield, even when every instinct screams to stop. The major twist that unravels here is the revelation of just how deeply the conspiracy runs. It is not only external enemies who orchestrated the siege, but betrayal embedded within the very structures meant to protect. Allies prove compromised, familiar codes and protocols exposed, secrets handed over to those who exploit them. The Protector understands now that survival is not merely a matter of fighting off invaders. It is about rooting out the rot that allowed them inside. This revelation adds a chilling layer to the narrative. It is not just a story of invasion, but of corrosion, of loyalty hollowed out from within. In one of the story's most haunting passages, the Protector finally reaches the chamber where the leader is held. The orchestrators are there, circling their captive, tightening their grip on the fragile thread of his survival. The confrontation that follows is less a battle than a crucible. The Protector crashes through with the fury of devotion, every strike fueled by the years of loyalty, by the memory of failure he refuses to repeat. The fight is brutal, unrelenting, bodies colliding against walls, weapons tearing through silence. The orchestrators wield not only violence but rhetoric, taunting him with the inevitability of collapse, insisting that his loyalty is wasted, that one man cannot shield against the tide of vengeance. Yet he persists, battered but unbroken, and in his persistence lies the answer to their conviction, that loyalty, even when fragile, can be stronger than certainty hardened into cruelty. The climax spirals into chaos as the invaders, realizing their grip is slipping, unleash their final, desperate assault. Explosives are rigged, timers set, the building itself transformed into a death trap. The Protector drags the leader through collapsing corridors, each step a defiance against inevitability. Smoke blinds, fire roars, the walls themselves seem to conspire against them. Yet within this maelstrom, the two men, the Protector and the leader, share moments stripped of formality. Words whispered in the dark carry gratitude, recognition, the fragile intimacy of survival. The leader, once distant in ceremony, now speaks not as a symbol, but as a man, acknowledging not only his Protector's sacrifice, but his humanity. For me, these quiet moments amid fire are the story's heartbeat, reminders that survival is not about monuments, but about bonds forged in fragility. The final confrontation with the orchestrators is as much philosophical as it is physical. The Protector does not merely fight bodies. He fights the idea that destruction is inevitable, that betrayal has triumphed, that fragility means weakness. His blows, his refusals to yield, are arguments in themselves, declarations that resilience, though imperfect, is stronger than vengeance. The orchestrators fall not with grand speeches, but with the hollow silence of men whose conviction has been undone by endurance. It is not glory that marks their defeat, but exhaustion, the brutal reality that persistence can outlast even the most meticulously planned collapse. As the dust settles, the story shifts into resolution, though it refuses to offer easy comfort. The building is scarred, its halls filled with the echoes of fire. The city, too, bears wounds, smoke still curling into the sky, sirens still wailing through the streets. The leader, though alive, carries the weight of vulnerability revealed, his authority forever touched by the knowledge of how fragile it truly is. The protector, battered and scarred, stands not as a flawless hero, but as a man who endured, who carried his loyalty through fire and betrayal, who found redemption not in perfection, but in persistence. What gives the resolution its haunting power is its refusal to erase scars. The building will be rebuilt, but it will never be untouched. The leader will continue, but he will never be unmarked. The protector will move forward, but the memory of failure and survival will remain etched into him. This is not the restoration of permanence, but the acceptance of fragility, a recognition that survival itself is enough, that endurance is its own kind of victory. The final images linger like echoes. The protector standing in the dawn's light, his body bruised but upright. The leader beside him, not as a distant figure, but as a man whose life was saved by loyalty. The city skyline scarred but enduring, its smoke curling upward like a reminder of fragility, its silhouette a testament to resilience. These images remind us that the story was never only about explosions or battles, but about what survives after collapse: loyalty, resilience, humanity. What makes this conclusion resonate so deeply for me is the way it mirrors truths we already know in our own lives. That permanence is always an illusion. That betrayal cuts deeper than any external blow. That resilience, though messy and imperfect, is stronger than certainty hardened into cruelty. That loyalty, though a burden, is also salvation. And that survival, though scarred, is still survival. And sometimes that is the most profound form of triumph. The story closes not with glory, but with recognition. Recognition that fragility and resilience are forever intertwined. Recognition that authority is only ever human. Recognition that endurance is itself a form of redemption. And recognition that, in the end, what defines us is not the monuments we build, but the bonds we carry, the loyalties we honor, the persistence we refuse to abandon even when the world crumbles around us. In this closing tableau, the protector does not stand as a legend untouchable by time, but as a man who stumbled, who failed, who endured, who refused to yield. And that, perhaps, is why the story lingers. Not because it offers the perfection of myth, but because it offers the fragility of humanity, and in that fragility, the stubborn, haunting beauty of survival. The people who carry this story are not mere silhouettes against fire and smoke. They're the marrow of a narrative, the figures whose fractures and resilience breathe life into the spectacle. To watch their movements, their words, their silences, is to recognize archetypes we've encountered in literature and history, yet shaped with a rawness that makes them painfully human. Their arcs are not just plot devices, but explorations of loyalty, grief, conviction, and fragility. When the walls fall and monuments crumble, it is through these characters that we glimpse the soul of the story. At the center of it all stands the protector, a man whose very identity has been welded to duty. He is not merely a figure of strength, not a one-dimensional savior whose fists and weapons define him. What makes him compelling is the contradiction inside him. A man who radiates physical power but is haunted by failure. A man whose loyalty is absolute but whose confidence is scarred. His tragedy begins not with the siege itself, but with the icy night on the bridge, where he reached for life and came back with loss. That single moment fractures him, turning his sense of self into a wound he cannot cauterize. He defines himself as a guardian, yet when the one under his care was lost, he became, in his own mind, a man unworthy of trust. This contradiction carries him forward. Every punch he throws, every risk he takes, every reckless act of self-sacrifice is not simply for duty, but for redemption. He is fighting not only enemies, but his own ghost, the shadow of a night he could not forget. This duality places him alongside the tragic heroes of literature. Hamlet haunted by hesitation, Achilles carrying rage that is both power and curse. The protector here is haunted by loyalty, a devotion so deep it becomes both salvation and torment. He cannot stop protecting because to stop would mean surrendering the last thread of meaning he clings to. His bruises are not symbols of invulnerability. They are proof that redemption must be earned in blood and pain. Yet what makes him most human are his quiet moments. The way his eyes linger on the leader, betraying both devotion and guilt. The way his silences carry more weight than speeches, as though every word he withholds is a confession. In these moments, he is not a soldier or a weapon, but a man wrestling with himself, trying to reconcile failure with persistence. He embodies the paradox that literature so often reveals, that strength is most profound when it carries the shadow of fragility. The leader himself is another fascinating study, a figure who begins cloaked in authority but is gradually stripped until nothing remains but raw humanity. When we first encounter him, he is more symbol than man, commanding, ceremonial, elevated above those around him. His power rests not only in his office, but in the illusion of permanence, the belief that he represents something larger than himself. Yet the story dismantles this illusion with ruthless efficiency. When catastrophe strikes, when explosions tear through walls, when his life is reduced to bargaining chips in the hands of enemies, he is revealed as simply a man, vulnerable and afraid. This transformation is not humiliation, it is revelation. Like Lear wandering the storm without his crown, the leader here is at his most human when stripped of ceremony. He no longer speaks as authority, but as flesh, his fear palpable, his dependence undeniable. And in this vulnerability lies the most profound truth of leadership. That power is fragile, that authority is only ever a mask worn by mortal men. His reliance on the protector becomes symbolic, a recognition that survival depends not on the grandeur of office, but on trust in another human being. The bond that forms between him and his protector is not hierarchical, but existential. Two men bound not by titles, but by survival. The antagonists, the orchestrators of the siege, are cut from a different cloth. They are not portrayed as senseless monsters, nor as caricatures of rage. They are men of conviction, of grievance sharpened into certainty, of ideology hardened into cruelty. What unsettles is not their violence, but their calm. They move with patience. They speak with clarity, their words framed as logic even as their actions burn with destruction. To them, this siege is not chaos but justice, not madness but inevitability. They believe themselves righteous, and it is precisely this belief that makes them dangerous symbolically. They represent the corruption of conviction. Literature is filled with figures like them, men who begin with grievance, who feel wronged by history, and who allow that wound to harden into justification for cruelty. Their eyes burn not with frenzy, but with certainty, a certainty that leaves no room for empathy. In their speeches and threats, in their careful orchestration of collapse, they embody the peril of ideology untethered from compassion. They are reflections of what conviction becomes when it calcifies into vengeance. Their humanity makes them chilling. They are not demons, but men who have chosen destruction over forgiveness. The leader's family, though their presence is brief, leaves an emotional imprint that echoes through the entire story. The First Lady, lost in the icy river, is more than a character. She is the embodiment of fragility, the reminder that even the most protected lives can be extinguished in seconds. Her death is not only the leader's grief, but the protector's wound, a ghost haunting every step of his journey. She becomes a symbol of what is at stake, not just survival, but the unbearable cost of failure. Her absence fills the story with silence, a silence that follows the characters through every corridor of smoke and fire. The supporting figures, too, carry symbolic weight. Fellow agents who fall in battle embody the collapse of trust. Their uniforms, once promising safety, now soaked in betrayal. Civilians who scatter in terror remind us that behind every political conflict are ordinary lives shattered without warning. Each face glimpsed in passing, each life extinguished in the chaos, grounds the story in humanity. The siege may be orchestrated on a grand scale, but its true victims are the countless unnamed caught in its fire. What fascinates me is how the relationships between these characters form a web of meaning. The protector and the leader embody loyalty and fragility, their bond forged in crisis, their survival dependent on one another. The orchestrators embody conviction corrupted into vengeance, standing as distorted mirrors to the protector's loyalty. The family and the civilians embody the collateral cost of conflict, the fragility of human life caught between power and chaos. Together, they form a tapestry that elevates the story beyond action into allegory. The protector's arc is, ultimately, one of redemption. He begins fractured, haunted by failure, unsure of his worth. He endures through fire, through betrayal, through endless wounds, not because he seeks glory, but because he cannot surrender loyalty. His victory is not triumph, but survival, not perfection, but persistence. The leader's arc is one of revelation. He begins cloaked in authority, distant and ceremonial, and he is reduced to raw humanity, stripped of illusions, forced to rely on trust. His survival is not triumph, but recognition. That authority is fragile, that survival is dependent on bonds, not symbols. The orchestrator's arc is one of destruction, their certainty collapsing not under ideology, but under endurance. They believe themselves inevitable, but they are undone by persistence, by resilience, by the refusal of loyalty to yield. And it is here that the symbolic resonance of the characters becomes clearest. The protector is the shield, not flawless, but battered and scarred, carrying his loyalty even when it breaks him. The leader is the crown, glorious yet fragile, revealed as human when stripped of ceremony. The orchestrators are the flame, burning with conviction, consuming without mercy, undone by their own arrogance. The first lady is the ghost, the fragility of life, the wound that never heals, the silence that drives every act of devotion. The civilians are the chorus, reminding us that history is never just the story of kings and protectors, but of countless unnamed lives caught in its fire. What lingers when all is done are the eyes of these characters, the weary gaze of the protector, lined with both guilt and devotion, the haunted eyes of the leader, carrying both grief and gratitude, the burning certainty of the orchestrators, undone by endurance, the fleeting terror in the eyes of civilians swept into chaos. These eyes tell the true story, a story not of explosions, but of humanity, fragile, resilient, contradictory, and enduring. In the end, the characters transform spectacle into meaning. They remind us that loyalty is both salvation and burden, that authority is only ever human, that conviction without empathy is destruction, and that fragility is not weakness but the soil from which resilience grows. They are not heroes and villains in the simple sense. They are mirrors, reflecting truths we recognize in ourselves, our failures, our loyalties, our convictions, our fragility. And it is through them that the story lingers, not as an action film alone, but as a meditation on what it means to endure when the world collapses around you. There's something strangely intoxicating about peeling back the curtain on a film that, at first glance, seems so straightforward. A siege, a protector, a city under fire. These are the things that appear on screen, sharp and relentless. But hidden beneath that spectacle lies a quieter, stranger narrative, the story of how it was made, of the people who sweated and stumbled behind the camera, of the accidents that twisted into blessings, of the curious coincidences and little-known choices that shaped what we now take as inevitable. The finished film presents itself as seamless, inevitable, fully formed. Yet the truth is that its making was anything but neat. It was marked by strangeness, by chance, by stories that read like parables about the unpredictable alchemy of cinema. The very existence of the project is itself a curious tale. In the early 2010s, two studios, working entirely independently, decided to tell a story about the White House falling under siege. It was an odd doubling, almost uncanny, like a mirror suddenly splitting into two reflections. On one side was the version that became this film, stripped of gloss, darker, brutal, almost claustrophobic in its intimacy. On the other side was its glossier twin, a rival project produced with Hollywood sheen and spectacle. For months, the industry whispered about the coincidence, about the strangeness of two nearly identical ideas blooming in the same soil. It was a race, not a plot, but of production. Who could get there first? Who could seize the zeitgeist? The fact that both made it to release within months of each other only adds to the oddity, leaving audiences with a strange choice. Which reflection of the same nightmare to watch? The strangeness did not stop there. This film, unlike its rival, embraced its grit. The director, Antoine Fuqua, was insistent from the beginning. This story would not be polished in a fantasy. It would be brutal, bloody, grounded. In interviews, he spoke of his inspiration less in terms of blockbusters and more in terms of war films. He wanted the siege to feel claustrophobic, the violence to sting, the blood to matter. This insistence led to unusual choices in production. Extras were trained like soldiers, moving with the precision of military drills. Sets were designed not as grand backdrops, but as mazes of vulnerability, scarred and claustrophobic. Even the lighting was harsh, unforgiving, designed to strip away glamour and leave behind only rawness. It was a war film disguised as a thriller, and that odd choice gave it a texture unlike its sibling project. One of the strangest behind-the-scenes facts lies in the making of the White House itself. You would think the production might rely on digital trickery alone to recreate such an iconic space, but no. Much of it was built by hand, meticulously reconstructed in Shreveport, Louisiana. On sound stages and backlots, carpenters and painters erected a facsimile of one of the most guarded buildings in the world. Every column, every facade, every detail was replicated with obsessive care, only for much of it to be blown apart in orchestrated chaos. Imagine the strangeness of it. Craftsmen laboring over the reproduction of monuments of power, only for explosives to undo their work day after day. It is cinema's paradox in its purest form. Painstaking creation in the service of destruction. Actors often speak of being unsettled by this set. To walk through those halls, to stand before those facades, was to feel as if one had been transported into the real seat of power, only twisted by fire and smoke. Extras who played Secret Service agents spoke of goosebumps when they first donned their uniforms and marched across the mock lawn. Even though they knew it was plywood and paint, the illusion carried weight. Some crew members joked darkly that the set felt cursed, too convincing in its replication, as if it tempted fate to blur the line between fiction and reality. The film's lead, Gerard Butler, was not only its star but also one of its producers. His devotion to the project was fierce, almost obsessive. He pushed himself through grueling stunt sequences, often insisting on performing the physical work himself. Stories circulate of him emerging from days of filming with bruises so vivid they seemed painted on, of him limping off set only to return the next morning with the same stubborn grin. For him, authenticity mattered. "If I bleed," he once said, "I want it to be real." That stubbornness lent the film a rawness, but also alarmed producers who feared the entire project could halt if their star was seriously injured. Yet Butler refused to relent, and his bruises became part of the film's DNA, woven into the authenticity that audiences felt but never fully understood. One unusual production story involved the use of practical explosions. In an era increasingly dominated by digital effects, the director insisted on as much realism as possible. Real fire, real smoke, real debris cascading through carefully designed sets. The result was chaos that was sometimes too convincing. On more than one occasion, actors stumbled in panic when explosions misfired, their reactions captured on film and folded into the final cut. What audiences see as terror is sometimes not performance at all, but genuine shock, the raw edge of unpredictability preserved forever on screen. Another little-known detail involves the sound design. The team worked obsessively to ensure that every bullet, every explosion, carried a physical weight. They layered recordings of real gunfire with distorted echoes, adding metallic reverberations that made the White House sound less like a building and more like a war zone. One sound engineer later admitted he recorded his own heartbeat, slowed and amplified, and wove it into the low-frequency hum of certain scenes. That subtle sound, buried beneath explosions, was meant to mimic the subconscious pounding of fear, a detail no audience member would consciously notice, but all would feel. The choice of location for shooting was also steeped in irony. Louisiana, far removed from Washington, D.C., became the surrogate capital, its sound stages transformed into the heart of American power. The irony of staging a siege of the White House in the Deep South was not lost on the crew. Some locals, wandering past the sprawling set, were unsettled by the sight of their own backyard dressed as a battlefield of national collapse. There were even reports of passers-by stopping in shock, convinced for a moment that something catastrophic had truly occurred. The casting itself brought its own curious stories. Morgan Freeman, who stepped into the role of a high-ranking government figure, was as dignified off-camera as he was on. Crew members often described his presence as grounding, as if the set calmed whenever he spoke. Yet he too was drawn into the strangeness of the production. One day, after hours of watching stage destruction, he reportedly muttered, half to himself, "We're playing with fire, aren't we?" It was said with a smile, but the unease lingered, the recognition that cinema had a way of blurring lines too easily. Another fascinating detail lies in the rivalry between this film and its glossy counterpart, White House Down. Industry insiders whispered of espionage, of scripts leaked, and strategies copied. The coincidence of their existence became its own strange subplot, with critics comparing not only the films but the very atmospheres of their productions. This film leaned into grit and intensity. Its rival leaned into humor and spectacle. The strange doubling remains one of the most curious episodes in Hollywood's history, a reminder that even stories of collapse can emerge in duplicate, as if the cultural imagination itself had conspired to tell them at once. Even the release carried oddities. When the film premiered, some audiences found it uncomfortably close to real-world fears. Only a decade earlier, the world had already witnessed attacks on symbols once thought untouchable, and so to watch the White House scarred and burning on screen was more than spectacle. It was déjà vu. Some critics accused the film of exploiting those anxieties. Others praised it for forcing audiences to confront them. The controversy itself became part of its legacy, proof of how thin the line is between fiction and memory, between entertainment and trauma. One of the strangest facts, perhaps, is how much of the chaos audiences saw was shaped by accidents. Rainstorms that delayed shooting created puddles that reflected firelight in eerie beauty, turning delays into visual gifts. A stunt performer once tripped on debris not meant to be in his path, his stumble so raw that the director kept it in, weaving it into the texture of chaos. Smoke machines malfunctioned, flooding sets with clouds thicker than intended, leaving actors coughing and improvising their way through scenes that later appeared terrifyingly authentic. These accidents remind us that cinema, for all its planning, thrives on imperfection, that sometimes the most convincing chaos is born not of control, but of chance. Trivia, too, adds layers of strangeness. The flag used in one pivotal shot, tattered and burning, was reportedly an authentic piece borrowed from military archive. Its history is real as its flames. The security codes spoken in the film, though altered for safety, were close enough to real terminology that consultants worried they revealed too much. Even the choreography of Secret Service movements was taught by former agents, their expertise lending authenticity but also making some viewers uneasy. Was this entertainment or a manual for catastrophe? What lingers after uncovering these facts is a sense of how precarious cinema is. What we see on screen feels seamless, inevitable, but the truth is stranger. Sets built only to be destroyed. Actors bruising themselves in pursuit of authenticity. rival films competing to tell the same nightmare. Sound engineers weaving heartbeats into explosions. Accidents turned into art. The strangeness of the film's making mirrors the strangeness of its story. Permanence undone by collapse. Control undone by chaos. Fragility revealed beneath illusion. When I reflect on these behind-the-scenes tales, I see more than trivia. I see metaphors. The set built in Louisiana to mimic the White House becomes a lesson in how illusions shape our perception of power. The rival films released side by side become a reminder of how stories emerge collectively from cultural fears. The accidents turned into art become proof that resilience, even in production, is what creates meaning. The bruises carried by the lead actor become emblems of loyalty, as though he too was bound to protect the story at all costs. In the end, the strangest facts about this film are not merely curiosities, but extensions of its themes. Just as the story on screen explores fragility, betrayal, and resilience, so too does its making reveal the fragility of production, the betrayals of chance, the resilience of artists turning accidents into meaning. The White House may not have truly fallen, but in Louisiana, in smoke-filled sound stages, in the bruises of its actors and the laughter of its crew, something equally strange unfolded. A reflection of chaos, crafted into a story that still lingers, scarred and unforgettable. There is always something haunting about a story that begins with ceremony and ends in fire, about a narrative that opens with symbols of permanence only to dismantle them with brutality. The events within this film are not simply bursts of action or explosions strung together for spectacle. They're structured with a kind of ruthless intentionality. They force us, as viewers, into an uncomfortable recognition that even the strongest institutions, the most carefully guarded spaces, the most polished rituals of power, are fragile. To trace these events critically is to walk through corridors that echo with more than gunfire. They echo with allegory, with metaphor, with the heavy resonance of truths we would often rather avoid. The first major event worth considering is the accident on the bridge, that icy night when duty and fate collided in tragedy. This moment is not merely a prologue or a setup for character motivation. It is the crucible that defines the entire narrative. On its surface, it is the story of a protector failing to save the First Lady, a moment of grief that ripples into every choice made thereafter. But critically, it functions as allegory. The bridge itself becomes a symbol, a liminal space between safety and chaos, between permanence and collapse. When the car plunges into the frozen river, it is not only a woman lost. It is the shattering of illusion, the rupture of belief that duty can overcome fate. This event frames the protector not as an invincible figure, but as a tragic one, a man scarred by failure, his loyalty tainted by guilt. From this moment forward, every act of devotion is also an act of penance. Without this tragedy, the siege that follows would be only spectacle. With it, the story gains its human core. The second significant event is the attack itself, the sudden eruption of fire upon the city's skyline. What unsettles here is not merely the violence, but the way it arrives. A plane descending in silence, protocols proving useless, a city that has lived in the shadow of invulnerability suddenly scarred. The symbolism is stark. Air, that most open of spaces, becomes a weapon. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, becomes the harbinger of collapse. This inversion is crucial to the film's impact. Critics often note how such imagery recalls real-world traumas, and indeed, the resonance is deliberate. To watch monuments of stability burn is to feel the fragility of permanence in our own world. The event is staged not only for adrenaline, but for unease, for the echo it leaves long after the smoke clears. It is less about what we see than what it reminds us of, the haunting realization that safety is always thinner than we imagine. Once the siege takes hold, the corridors of power transform into something almost Gothic. Halls once meant for ceremony are turned into battlegrounds, offices into traps, chambers into prisons. From a critical perspective, This transformation of space is one of the story's most profound devices. Buildings are never neutral in literature or film. They carry meaning, embody permanence, reflect authority. To watch them defiled, scarred, repurposed as sites of chaos is to watch authority itself dismantled. The White House here is not simply a backdrop. It becomes a character, wounded, violated, a metaphor for the nation itself. Critics often debate whether this imagery leans too heavily on spectacle, but there is no denying its emotional resonance. When a building that symbolizes continuity is shown in ruins, the unease lingers. The event is not simply an attack on walls, but on the idea of permanence itself. Within this labyrinth of betrayal and fire lies another pivotal event, the capture of the leader. This inversion of power, this stripping of authority, is critical. The leader who once stood untouchable, flanked by guards and ceremony, is reduced to a hostage, a man whose survival depends on mercy he will not be given. From a critical perspective, this is the narrative's great unmasking. Authority is revealed as human. Power, stripped of its rituals and symbols, is revealed as fragile. The leader here mirrors tragic kings of literature, Lear cast into the storm, Priam pleading at Achilles' feet. His capture forces us to recognize the mortality beneath the crown. This event resonates emotionally because it dismantles our illusions alongside his, showing us that even the most powerful can be reduced to silence when the structures they rely upon collapse. The orchestrators of chaos, revealed through this event, embody another critical layer of analysis. They are not drawn as raving lunatics, but as men of conviction. Their words drip with rhetoric. Their eyes burn with certainty. Their cause presented not as madness, but as logic. Critics often divide here. Some accuse the film of painting them too broadly, while others argue that their humanity is precisely what makes them terrifying. What matters is the conviction itself. This event reveals them not as shadows, but as ideologues, convinced that destruction is justice. From a symbolic perspective, they embody the danger of conviction untethered from empathy, the peril of certainty hardened into cruelty. Their presence transforms the siege from chaos into allegory. It is not only about weapons and fire, but about ideas, about the seductive power of belief that blinds itself to compassion. The Protector's reemergence as the agent of resilience becomes another critical event. Having withdrawn into obscurity after the bridge accident, he re-enters the corridors of power not out of duty alone, but out of the need for redemption. His journey through the siege is as much internal as external. Every enemy faced, every wound endured, is both a battle against others and a battle against himself. From a critical perspective, his survival through these events symbolizes the paradox of resilience. It is not invincibility, but persistence in spite of failure. His arc echoes the tragic heroes of literature who stumble but rise again, who find meaning not in glory but in endurance. The emotional resonance here lies in recognition. We see ourselves in his bruises, in his persistence, in his refusal to yield even when everything has collapsed. His journey becomes an allegory for resilience in the face of fragility, for persistence when certainty is gone. One of the film's most significant twists is the revelation of betrayal from within. Enemies disguised in uniforms once trusted, protocols turned against their makers, secrets handed over by those meant to guard them. This is the wound deeper than any explosion. Critics often point to this twist as formulaic, but from a symbolic standpoint, it carries immense weight. Betrayal is always more devastating than attack from without, because it corrodes faith itself. Literature is filled with this motif. Caesar stabbed by his friends, Othello undone by Iago. Here, too, the betrayal resonates because it reminds us that collapse often begins not with external assault, but with corrosion within. This event transforms the siege from external invasion into internal rot, forcing us to confront the fragility of trust. The climactic event, When the protector finally reaches the leader and confronts the orchestrators, is staged as both physical and philosophical. The fight itself is brutal, unrelenting, bodies colliding in corridors filled with fire and smoke. The solution was both audacious and painstaking. A near full-scale replica was constructed in Shreveport, Louisiana, using sound stages and sprawling backlots. Carpenters, set designers, and painters worked with almost monastic devotion, poring over photographs, architectural blueprints, and first-hand descriptions. They recreated not only the grand facades, but even the subtle textures of stone, the weathering of paint, the echo of hallways. For months, the White House stood not in Washington, but in Louisiana, a ghost of power rising from Southern soil. And then, just as carefully as it had been built, it was blown apart, piece by piece, in orchestrated chaos. Crew members often spoke of how unsettling it was to walk onto that set, to stand in front of those columns, to step into rooms so meticulously reconstructed, was to feel as if one had trespassed into the real corridors of power. One extra recalled how, in uniform and standing on the replica lawn, he felt a shiver run through him. Not because of the story, but because the illusion was too perfect. It felt wrong, he said, like I shouldn't be here. Others joked that it was cursed, that a replica so convincing risked drawing catastrophe into reality. These half-serious whispers reveal something deeper. That cinema, in recreating illusion, often edges too close to truth. The director, Antoine Fuqua, was adamant from the beginning that this would not be a polished, glossy action film. His vision was one of grit, of brutality, of claustrophobic realism. To achieve this, he insisted on practical effects wherever possible. Explosions were staged with real fire. Debris rained down in storms of plaster and dust. Sets were rigged to collapse with terrifying authenticity. He wanted the actors to feel danger, to carry the weight of chaos in their bodies, not just their performances. This insistence often unnerved the crew, who were tasked with orchestrating destruction while ensuring safety. Yet it was this devotion to authenticity that gave the film its unique texture, its unflinching brutality. Fuqua treated The Siege less like an action spectacle and more like a war film, grounding every frame in sweat, grit, and urgency. Gerard Butler, both star and producer, matched this intensity with a stubborn devotion of his own. He insisted on performing many of his own stunts, brushing aside concerns about injury or insurance. The bruises he carried home were real, his exhaustion palpable. Crew members recalled how, after long days of fighting through smoke-filled corridors, he would emerge with his skin raw, his knuckles scraped, his body aching. And yet he wore these injuries almost proudly, as though they were proof that he had given himself fully to the role. "If I bleed," he once remarked, "I want it to be real." His commitment was not about vanity, but about authenticity. He believed the audience could sense when an actor held back, and he refused to allow even the smallest gesture to feel false. One of the strangest and most fascinating aspects of the production was how accidents often lent the film its most convincing moments. During one sequence, an explosion designed to collapse a wall went off seconds later than planned. The actors, caught off guard, flinched and stumbled in panic. Rather than reshoot, Fuqua insisted on keeping the take. The rawness of their fear, unscripted and genuine, was more powerful than anything choreographed. In another instance, a stunt performer tripped on debris not meant to be in his path. His scramble to recover so chaotic that it felt utterly real. That too was folded into the final cut, a reminder that cinema thrives not in perfection, but in imperfection embraced. The sound design carried its own layer of strange artistry. The team wanted gunfire and explosions to feel suffocating, visceral. They recorded real weapons, layering them with metallic reverberations that made each shot echo like thunder in a confined space. But they went further. One sound engineer revealed later that he recorded his own heartbeat, slowed and distorted, weaving it beneath certain sequences as a low-frequency hum. The idea was simple yet unsettling: to mimic the subconscious pounding of fear, to make audiences feel unease without even realizing why. It was a secret heartbeat pulsing beneath the film, unnoticed but always felt. Weather too played its role, mischievous and generous by turns. Rainstorms in Louisiana delayed shoots, flooding sets and forcing long nights of waiting. Yet when the storms cleared, they left puddles that reflected firelight in eerie beauty, giving the destruction an almost painterly quality. Wind gusts carried smoke across the sets in unpredictable patterns, sometimes obscuring cameras, sometimes creating images too haunting to have been planned. The crew learned to treat the weather as a collaborator, frustrating yet strangely generous. Out of inconvenience came moments of accidental poetry. The rivalry with White House Down, a film with almost the same premise, released the same year, cast its own shadow over production. Cast and crew were aware that they were racing not only against time, but against a mirror image of their own story. The tension gave the set an edge, as though everyone involved knew they had to dig deeper, push harder, embrace grit rather than gloss. Fuqua often reminded his team that their version was the darker twin, the one that would not flinch. This rivalry became a kind of strange motivation, an invisible adversary spurring them forward. Not all strangeness was grim. Humor threaded its way through the exhaustion, because without laughter the weight would have been unbearable. The stunt team was notorious for pranks, replacing prop coffee with salt water, sneaking mannequins into collapsing sets to startle unsuspecting crew members. Even Butler himself joined in, once slipping into a security guard's uniform and wandering the set until someone realized the extra was the star. These moments of absurdity were crucial. Amid the dust and fire, they reminded everyone that this was, after all, a story, a crafted illusion, a grand game that could not exist without camaraderie. Morgan Freeman, stepping into his role with characteristic gravitas, became a grounding presence on set. Crew members often remarked that his voice seemed to calm even the chaos, as though the sheer resonance of it steadied the air. Yet he too confessed unease at times. After watching one particularly brutal sequence, he muttered to a colleague, "We're playing with fire." It was said with a half-smile, but the weight behind it lingered. Freeman understood, perhaps more than most, how cinema could unearth wounds too close to reality. The editing process carried its own curiosities. Hours of footage were pored over, trimmed, reshaped into rhythm. Fuqua was meticulous, almost obsessive about pacing. He treated explosions like notes in a symphony, timing them with breath, silence, and crescendo. At one point, an editor suggested softening the violence, trimming away the brutality. Fuqua refused. "If it hurts," he said, "let it hurt." This insistence gave the film its edge, its refusal to soothe audiences with comfort. The brutality was not indulgence but philosophy, a reminder that collapse is never clean, that violence scars. Trivia abounds in the making of the film. The American flag burned on screen was an authentic piece borrowed from a military archive, its history real even as it became a symbol of fiction. The choreography of the Secret Service movements was overseen by former agents, lending the actors' gestures an unsettling authenticity. Even the codes and jargon spoken in the film were close enough to reality that consultants worried they revealed too much. These details, hidden beneath spectacle, are part of what made the story feel so disturbingly real. The legacy of the film's making is not just the spectacle it produced, but the strange truths it revealed about cinema itself. Sets built with reverence, destroyed with precision. Actors bruised in pursuit of authenticity. Accidents embraced as gifts. Rival films spurring determination. Humor and exhaustion woven together like threads of survival. What emerges is not only a film, but a reflection of its own themes. Just as a story on screen explores fragility, betrayal, and resilience, so too did its making embody fragility of process, betrayals of chance, resilience of crew. When I think of this production now, I see more than trivia. I see the carpenters in Louisiana painting stone to look eternal, only for explosives to undo their work. I see Butler wiping blood, sometimes real, sometimes fake, from his hands, refusing to yield. I see Fuqua prowling the set like a conductor of destruction, timing chaos like music. I see extras startled by explosions that misfired, their panic folded into performance. I see rain turning rubble into mirrors of fire, accidents into poetry. The strangest facts of this film's making mirror the strangest truths of its story. That permanence is always illusion, that collapse is always near, that resilience emerges not from perfection but from persistence. Just as the protector endured through fire and betrayal, so too did the film endure through setbacks and accidents, creating meaning out of chaos. The siege, in a way, was lived not only by characters but by the crew themselves. They too survived collapse. They too turned fragility into resilience. They too carried scars of exhaustion that became part of the final story. And perhaps that is the most fascinating insight of all, that cinema is never magic but labor, never inevitability but chance transformed into art. Behind the screen's fire and smoke lies the sweat of human beings who stumbled, laughed, improvised, and endured. And in their persistence, as much as in the story they crafted, we glimpse the haunting beauty of resilience. The setting of this story is not merely a backdrop, not a stage upon which characters perform their roles and events unfold. It is, instead, the living fabric of a narrative, woven into every choice, every burst of violence, every moment of silence. To explore the film critically is to understand that its locations are more than geography. They are symbols, mirrors, and traps, each space crafted to evoke fragility, menace, and resilience. Through architecture, lighting, framing, and texture, the film transforms its settings into characters of their own, shaping mood and meaning in ways no line of dialogue could ever replicate. It begins with winter, snow draped across trees and roads, a chill in the air that seems to sharpen edges, to remind us of nature's indifference. The opening act, before chaos strikes, is wrapped in this wintry stillness. The motorcade moves through icy landscapes, the white of snow suggesting purity, order, permanence. Yet beneath that beauty lies menace. Ice on roads, storms thickening skies. It is within this setting that the first tragedy unfolds, and so the snow itself becomes symbolic. Its whiteness, so often linked to innocence, becomes the canvas for grief when metal collides and the First Lady's car plunges into darkness. Cinematically, this is a masterstroke. The purity of snow against the black of night, the gleam of headlights piercing the storm, the final silence when the river swallows her. All of it is heightened by the setting. Without the snow, without the ice, the accident might have felt ordinary. With it, the event becomes mythic, an allegory of fragility hidden beneath beauty. Then comes the city, Washington, D.C., itself transformed into a space of paradox. On one hand, it is a living museum, monuments, and marble carrying centuries of history. On the other, it is fragile, its very symbols targeted for desecration. The skyline of domes and obelisks stands serene at first, as though permanence were carved into stone. But the setting is a mask, waiting to be torn away by fire. When the assault arrives, the city becomes unrecognizable. The sky, once clear, is thick with smoke. Streets, once orderly, become veins of panic. The monuments, once symbols of stability, are scarred by fire. This transformation of setting is central to the film's emotional resonance. It forces the audience to recognize that permanence is always an illusion, that even the most iconic of spaces can be undone in minutes. The most significant setting, of course, is the White House. Here, the film's vision becomes claustrophobic, intimate, unrelenting. The building, perhaps the most recognizable seat of authority in the modern world, is no longer a symbol of continuity, but a labyrinth of fear. From the outside, its white facade gleams with history and power. Inside, it is a maze of corridors, offices, and chambers that transform depending on context. In the opening moments, these halls carry ceremony and order, guard stationed with discipline, staff moving with practiced rhythm. But once the siege begins, those same halls become suffocating. Cinematography shifts to handheld cameras, tight angles, shadows stretching across walls. The White House itself becomes a character betrayed, its every hallway now a trap, its very structure repurposed as a prison. Cinematography plays a crucial role in shaping how this setting is perceived. Wide establishing shots early in the story capture the grandeur of the White House, framing it with reverence, almost as though it were eternal. But once chaos erupts, the lens tightens, pressing viewers into cramped corridors, forcing them into proximity with sweat, blood, and debris. The shift in visual language mirrors the shift in narrative tone, from ceremony to survival, from permanence to fragility. This choice enhances atmosphere, turning a familiar symbol of order into an alien, threatening labyrinth. Light is another tool used masterfully within the setting. In early scenes, light is bright, clean, almost sterile. Offices gleam, windows spill daylight. Even the winter snow glows with purity. But once the attack begins, light fractures. Fires cast orange against stone. Shadows deepen until corridors feel endless. Smoke filters sunlight into dim, ghostly hues. In underground sequences, light is reduced to flickers, flashlights slicing darkness, bulbs swaying, shadows distorting space. This manipulation of light transforms setting into mood. The White House is no longer just a building. It is a haunted space, half in shadow, half in flame, echoing with menace. Sound design entwines with the settings to heighten atmosphere. In the snowy opening, silence dominates, crisp air broken only by engines and laughter. This stillness amplifies the tragedy of the accident, making the crash shatter not only lives but silence itself. Later, the siege fills the setting with noise, gunfire ricocheting through marble halls, explosions rattling foundations, alarms wailing endlessly. Yet silence returns strategically, just as important as noise. When the protector navigates corridors, moments of sudden stillness build dread, reminding us that settings are never neutral. They conceal menace in their very silence. One of the most striking uses of setting is the inversion of familiar spaces. The Oval Office, so often framed in cinema as a place of speeches and authority, becomes here a place of menace, its grandeur suffocated by shadows and smoke. The Situation Room, a symbol of command and strategy, is rendered powerless, its screens and codes turned useless against betrayal from within. Even the White House lawn, a symbol of ceremony and history, becomes a battlefield littered with bodies. These inversions are critical. They dismantle the illusion of sanctity, reminding us that spaces are only as strong as the people within them. What elevates these settings is their symbolic resonance. The White House, as both replica and metaphor, embodies permanence undone. Its scarred facades mirror the fragility of authority. Its burning halls mirror the betrayal of trust. Washington itself, transformed from marble to rubble, becomes an allegory for the collapse of illusions. Even the snowy bridge in the opening is symbolic, a liminal space where failure enters the story. The settings are not mere backgrounds. They are allegories that carry the film's themes into visual form. Cinematography deepens this symbolism through contrasts. Wide shots dwarf human figures against burning facades, emphasizing fragility. Close-ups press into faces, capturing sweat, fear, and determination, reminding us of resilience within fragility. Tilted frames disorient, handheld movements suffocate, static shots linger with reverence. Each choice of framing turns setting into mood, mood into meaning. Smoke is particularly symbolic, often filling frames, obscuring vision, reminding us that truth is never clear, that survival itself is a battle against obscurity. The underground tunnels deserve special attention. These settings embody descent, both literal and symbolic. Literature often treats descent into darkness as a passage into truth. And here, too, the tunnels reveal betrayal, corruption, and fragility. Their walls are tight, ceilings low, shadows endless. Cinematography presses in, suffocating the audience, making them feel the claustrophobia of entrapment. When characters move through these tunnels, they're not merely escaping, but confronting truths stripped of ceremony. The tunnels are the underworld of the story, a space of revelation as much as danger. Color palette enhances the setting's power. The snowy opening glows with whites and blues, a palette of purity undone by tragedy. The siege shifts into oranges, reds, and blacks, fire-consuming marble, chaos staining permanence. Later, blues and grays dominate again, cold and dim, reflecting the weight of survival. These colors guide emotion, purity, collapse, endurance. They remind us that settings are not static. They breathe with tone, shifting as the narrative deepens. Beyond the White House, smaller settings play symbolic roles. Streets filled with civilians remind us of the collateral cost, that history is written not only by leaders but by ordinary lives caught in chaos. Brief glimpses of monuments scarred by smoke remind us that history itself can be desecrated. Even offices, with their overturned chairs and shattered glass, remind us of the fragility of order. Each setting, no matter how brief, contributes to the tapestry of fragility and resilience. Critically, what makes the film settings so powerful is the way they mirror character arcs. The protector, scarred by failure, moves through scarred corridors, his resilience mirrored by the building's battered endurance.